The BAFTAs are the most prestigious film and television awards in the UK, but this year, a racial slur shouted during the broadcast has overshadowed that celebration. It's raising all kinds of questions on how we navigate race and disability. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. I've got Syrus Marcus Ware with us to unpack all of this. Cyrus, welcome back to the show, friend. Nice to see you.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. Listen, so the BAFTAs were on Sunday, and this particular incident happened. The stars of Sinners, Michael B. Jordan, Delroy Lindo, they were on stage. They were going to present the award for Best Visual Effects. Cyrus, what happened?
Well, they went up to present the awards, and someone who was in the audience, John Davidson, who has Tourette syndrome, has coprolalia, said the N-word very loudly. It was allowed to be heard. It rung out. And what happened immediately after was, well, first of all, there was very little care taken for the Black presenters. Alan Cummins apologized to the audience, and then the BBC chose to rebroadcast the N-word being said in subsequent broadcasts until people sort of protested online.
The person you mentioned this, the person who shouted is a disability activist. His name is John Davidson. He's the executive producer of a film called I Swear, which is based on his experience with Tourette syndrome. And I think, I should just clarify for folks who don't know, Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder that can cause people to make sudden movements or noises that are called tics. In some cases, can cause involuntary cursing. John Davidson has released a statement. He said he is, quote, deeply mortified if anyone considers my involuntary tics to be intentional or to carry any meaning, and chose to leave the auditorium early because he said, again, quote, was aware of the distress that his tics were causing. Cyrus, when you read John Davidson's statement, what's your reaction to it?
On the one hand, we just just to first of all say this is a really complex conversation, and we need to be able to hold multiple complex things at the same time, including disability justice and respect and love and care for Black communities who have to hear this word far too often in our social context.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I do understand, this actor saying I'm mortified, the tics are something that I can't control. And I also didn't really hear an apology. I really wish that in his apology, he had been able to say, these are the accommodations that I requested. This is the plan that we made in order to, reduce the amount of harm that might, be caused by my tics. And here's what didn't happen. And here's the impact. And we didn't see that, And so unfortunately, the apology sounded more like an explanation rather than an apology. Similarly, the apology, I'll put that in air quotes, from Alan Cummins, the host of the BAFTAs, immediately apologizing to the audience and excusing away the there's no space or time given to Black communities to be apologized to. And that's what didn't happen in this context.
I think I take a slightly different view from you, just in that sense, in that, I do think, Alan Cummings sort of owed more of an apology maybe than John Davidson did. But let me just go. Let's talk about the reaction that people sort of had online, because this incident went viral on Sunday night. A lot of different emotions from people online. Can you give us a sense of the spectrum of those reactions, particularly from Black people online? How is the reaction kind of playing out?
Understandably, people were really upset that this had been rebroadcast. It didn't need to be rebroadcast. Other things that were in the broadcast were cut out, including someone who said Free Palestine. That was edited out of the broadcast, but the N-word was allowed to continue. So people were upset. They were upset that there wasn't Black communities weren't being attended to. But what I also saw was and what was really disappointing was a lot of ableism, a lot of prominent Black folks saying we should have folks with Tourette's, outside of public spaces like this. And I saw a black comedian in the UK saying, couldn't he have been taken outside? And so this idea that we need to somehow banish or remove people with corpolalia, I saw a lot of that. I saw a lot of predictable bad takes from white disabled folks who, I wrote a paper called How Disability Studies Stays White and What Kind of White It Stays in 2008 about how white disability studies hasn't done a great job at taking up race and critical race theory and racial justice. And that's why we saw the advent of things like disability justice, where people were saying, hold on, disabled people of color really need to be centered here. I would argue that Black people with Tourette's, Black people with corpolalia, there really wasn't a lot of space given to those folks to speak yesterday about what their experiences was. So what I really tried to do was to uplift and amplify the voices of Black folks with corpolalia, who I think is who we should be listening to in this moment. So I saw a lot of disappointing ableism. I saw a lot of disappointing racism, and I saw a lack of care in general for Black people. The things that I heard where people were calling for a banishment and a removal of folks with Tourette's, that's going to directly affect Black people with Tourette's most specifically. Black disabled people are the ones who are going to be most directly affected by any of these type of ugly law type scenarios. The ugly laws were something that were on the books that prevented disabled people from being in public space. They were only struck down in the 1970s in Canada. So, we don't want to go back to a place where disabled people aren't able to be in public space. And who's going to be the most directly affected? It's going to be Black disabled people. So that's what I saw online, was a lot of misinformation, a lot of confusion, and a lot of harm, of exacerbated harm.
Yeah, I think that's what I appreciate about you, Syrus, is like your ability to sort of like to step out a little bit of 30,000 feet and kind of like look at this whole sort of context. And I know one of the things that you're thinking about is, what if it had been a person of color with this particular disability? What are your thoughts on that, like in terms of how this might have played differently? That's obviously difficult to speculate, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, we know that Black people are over-policed in public space, and I think that Black disabled people are over-policed in public space. We need only look at what's happened for Black disabled people, Black mad people, Black people with neurological conditions in the last 5 or 6 years. The fatalities, the targeting by police, all of these sort of exacerbated conditions. So we know that Black people aren't given the same grace, and Black disabled people are not given the same grace. So when Black disabled people behave in disabled ways in public space, in mad ways in public space, in neurologically different ways in public space, we are attacked, we are piled upon. And I don't think that same grace would have been given to a Black disabled person with Tourette's, which is why, again, I think we should be listening and turning in to the voices of Black folks with corporalia and really hear from them what they most think needs to happen, because those are the voices that are always going to be removed. And those are the voices that are always going to be targeted. There was a Black social media person who has corporalia, who I was following, and she was saying how, for so many of her experiences of having these involuntary tics, she's vilified in public space, absolutely vilified. Horrific things happen as a result of her tics. In this context, without any unpacking, immediately there's grace given to this white actor. And I think that has a lot to say about how anti-Blackness plays out in our community, about the perception of who's disabled and who's a good disabled person. I think there's a lot of things to deeply unpack here.
First of all, I just want to make the distinction that you just clarified there. Corporalia is specifically for verbal outbursts for people with Tourette's. So like not everybody with Tourette's has the outburst, but that is a specific kind of a version of having Tourette's. I want to go back to the thing that you mentioned earlier. The BAFTAs are not live, right? Like the awards were pre-recorded and edited, yet this made it to the broadcast, it made it to the BBC iPlayer later that night. The BBC and the BAFTAs have both apologized for not editing it out. How do you feel about the way that the BBC and the BAFTAs have handled this whole thing as it played out?
This is a textbook. People will study this for years to come about what not to do. The BAFTAs and the BBC absolutely, not only should they not have edited this out, they should have planned for access from the very beginning. When you know that you have disabled folks coming to your audience, you plan for access. And they did some planning, because they were able to make a statement at the beginning of the awards, apparently, that said there was someone in the audience who has Tourette syndrome. And that seems to be where their planning stopped. Where was the planning for what happens if harm comes up, if something harmful is said? They didn't seem to have prepared for that at all. And so they didn't plan for that. They didn't prepare for that. They should have had statements ready to go. They could have even planned for a way of responding that was, bringing the person who experiences Tourette's into the response. There could have been ways for this to have been handled if they had done the planning. This is what disabled people are always saying. Plan for us to be there and do the access works and the accommodation work in advance. Don't leave it until the moment when we're suddenly in need of these things to say, oh, I wish we had done better planning. They didn't plan for a disabled audience. They didn't plan for the Black presenters, knowing that there's a disabled person in the audience who has a tic that says the N-word. They didn't plan for the Black presenters, and they didn't make a plan for how they were going to respond if something harmful was said. They shouldn't have re-aired this broadcast. And then to, add insult to injury, Google, just to see anti-Blackness is so pervasive, Google was sharing this story and repeating the N-word in their sharing of the story as a news highlight to a bunch of people's phones. So Black disabled people couldn't get a break yesterday. It was really horrific.
Okay, so I got about 30 seconds left here, but I also want to mention that like Michael B. Jordan, Delroy Lindo, they were in Sinners. That film took home 3 awards. John Davidson film, I Swear, also won 3 BAFTAs. These are both films about marginalized communities, right? Like they should have been maybe celebrating their success. How are you feeling for those artists here?
Fundamentally, the film Sinners was about racial justice and racial injustice in these times. This incident is a perfect example. And I Swear was about the need to really seriously consider the presence of disabled people in public space. These two films show that we have a lot more work to do.
Well, Syrus, I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Thank you so much again, friend.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Syrus Marcus Ware is a visual artist, activist, and assistant professor at McMaster University. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see you then.